Hi, I'm Bob Hunter from Wood Magazine. As a tools editor, I get to review a lot of tools and write all the articles about them. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a heads up, kind of an overview of jointers. So in this room, I've got 6-inch jointers that we reviewed for a recent article, and I want to talk to you about a little bit about them. So first of all, what is a jointer? The jointer is this machine right here where it has a long flat bed, it has a cutter head in here powered by a motor, and you use it to clean the surfaces of wood, to flatten and straighten wood. Now, why would you do that? The reason is, if you've got rough sawn lumber like this board here, that even has a little bit of a cup to it, so it's not flat. The only way to truly flatten a board with a machine is a jointer, because you run it across the cutter head like that to flatten it. It might take several passes to do so. And then once you've got a face flat, you then put that face against the fence, and you run it across there, and that squares up an edge. That gives you a nice square edge here to a flattened face. Then you take the board to your thickness planer, and you'd run that through with the flattened face down. You run that through multiple times until you get it to the thickness that you want. Now, you can't really flatten a face on a thickness planer without using some kind of a jig or some type of holding device, because when you feed it through, the pressure feed rollers will want to do whatever, it'll follow whatever contour is already on the board. So you really have to flatten it first before you can do that. So these two machines work in sync. You really need to have both of them. What I've got here is a 6-inch jointer, which means that the cutter head is 6-inch wide, and that there's multiple sizes of jointers that get bigger, up to, I believe, 16 inches. You can get a lot of them. It doesn't really change a lot of the function, it's just the size and the capacity of the cutter head. So let me talk a little bit about the cutter heads. So jointers have two different types of cutter heads. The most traditional is this right here. This is a round, a cylindrical cutter head. This one has straight knives that span the full width of the cutter head. I got to be careful here. These are really sharp. So what I want to show is this is the cutter. This is the knife right there. It's held in a groove in the cutter head by the gib plate, which is this long black thing here, and then the bolts push against that, and they push against the opposite side of that little trench and then push the knife that way, and that holds it in place. You have to set these knives perfectly parallel to the tables in order to have a perfectly flat cut. And this one has 3 knives on it. Some of them have 4, some of them have 2, but all knives have to be in the same setting. So it takes a little bit of fussing sometimes to set that. There are some tools to help you. There's also some techniques that work. But once you get them set, it works really well. Another type of cutter head, which is newer in the last 15 or so years, is a spiral or helical cutter with indexable inserts. So what this is, each one of these cutters is its own 1/2-inch square cutting. These are carbide, so they've got 4 cutting edges. Each side is sharp, and it screws right into the cutter head. You just take one out, and you've got them. You can replace them, but each of these cuts individually, and then there are multiple rows across the cutter head, so that each one then fills in the gaps that are left behind by this row, so that by the time you're done, you get a nice clean cut all the way across. The beauty of these is that with them being carbide, they last longer. Also, you can easily replace any that get nicked. You can just turn those to a fresh edge. If you don't have to necessarily replace the whole knife like you would on a straight knife machine. So you can replace just the ones that are affected, and with 4 cutting edges, you can get a lot of long life out of one of these. There's several designs to a helical carbide head. They all do basically the same thing. Now, with the different types of cutter heads, you get 2 different types of cut quality. So I want to show these to you. This is an example of what you get with a straight knife cutter head. We've rubbed these walnut boards with chalk after we've made the cuts so that we could see the surface quality. And as you can see, it's pretty simple to see that it's pretty clean. If you get right into here, you start to see some little ripple marks that go clear across. That's what the cutter head, the straight knife cutter head, will do. You can really blend those in much better by slowing your feed rate, so you can really control the cut quality by your feed rate here with a straight knife. This is a really good example of a good cut quality. Now, with a helical or an indexing carbide insert cutter head, what it ends up happening is, through the geometry of the knives or the cutters there with that head, you end up with shallow grooves all along this. So by rubbing the chalk over it, we expose the high points So all the darker spots are a little bit deeper than the high parts. So when you come back over this, you're going to have to do a lot more sanding, planing, or scraping to get this flat. It's not a real big deal. This is more of an extreme example of from an indexing head that's got a little bit deeper grooves. But as you rub fingers across, you can just barely feel the high points. So it's enough that you definitely have to do this and get it flattened and get it polished up before you go to doing your finished surface. Otherwise, it will show under a clear coat or a stain. Okay, with the jointer, you've got a long bed that's made up of two different tables. So each of these, the tables are split at the cutter head. So the outfeed table is from the cutter head that way. The infeed table's over here. Obviously, you feed it this direction. So the infeed table, they each move independently of each other. So when you set them, you want to set the outfeed table always to the top of the arc of the cutter head. That way you don't get any snipe as it exits the cut. The infeed table, you move up and down with each cut to see, depending on what thickness you're trying to remove. This is an example of a wedge bed joiner, which means that the tables move up and down on dovetailed cast iron ways. And I'll just move this here so you can see how that slides up and down on these dovetails that are right here onto the cast iron. It moves pretty smoothly. Nothing wrong with that. Perfectly functional, good way to do it. Been doing this. This is an old style that's been around for a long time, still effective. Now, if there's a problem with this, the tables not being out of planar, if that means if they're not in a perfect plane with each other, you're going to have to shim the outfeed table to make it match the plane of the infeed table, because once you set that in place, you don't move it. So all you have to do with that, if you're doing it, is to just add some little thin metal shims into the dovetail ways over here on the outfeed side. It's a one-time process, probably, if you have to do it at all. And then you lock it in place and you never have to move it again. This is another way of adjusting a wedge bed joiner, is with these hand dials. They move a little bit slower than the lever did on that previous machine, but what the great thing of this is, it's a lot more precise, and you can able to really dial in if you're trying to just take a 64th of an inch off, say, you can do that much more precisely with one of these. The newer, a little bit more modern of a table here is called a parallelogram. And that's what this machine has, meaning that both tables are still independent from each other, but they work with two rods that go through. So there's a set of rods that go through here, and the table floats and basically moves in sync on those, so that as you move it down, they're moving in parallel to each other. So again, works perfectly great. The biggest advantage to one of this is that if you have to make the two tables coplanar, this is a much easier process to do. You wouldn't need to shim. It's just a mechanical adjustment to the parallelogram things on the outfeed table. With the jointer, you have a fence then that you use when you're squaring an edge, so that you can adjust this fence. All these fences usually adjust 45 degrees to an angle to a 90 degree. It's very seldom that you would do that, but most times get them set on 90 and you're good to go. Just make sure that your stops and everything are set up square. When you ease the adjustment of a fence back and forth, if you want to move it across the cutter head, let's say you don't need the full 6 inches, or in order to not put all your wear on that back part, you can bring the fence out forward and do some edge joining out on the front part of the cutter head. This jointer uses a rack and pinion system to move the fence. So it's just a simpler way, nice smooth way to do that. You can set the fence wherever you want and then lock it in place. This is a jointer with an example of what we call a keyway slide fence. So the fence moves back and forth manually. You just grab it or the handle to move it, and it just slides back and forth on this keyway. There's just a metal key right there embedded into the table, and then there's a hole in there, and it just slides. Simple as that. Lock it in place, and you're good to go. Now, this will sometimes leave some scratches across the bed, but that's not a big deal. It's just something that just happens there. It's part of the wear and tear of using it. Shouldn't affect the performance of it. With power switches on jointers are usually in two places. Some of them are down on the cabinet, down below the jointer table and bed. So your standard mechanical switch. You can reach down to turn it on, run your board across, and then come back and do that. It works fine, it's just that it requires you to stoop a little bit to get there. If you were in an emergency stop, sometimes it's a little harder to find and get to. A little bit easier to use, I find, is one that's mounted on a pedestal kind of behind the tables back here. Easy to start again, but with a large off paddle, you can run your board through, reach back and just hit that and you're off. A lot easier to get to, especially if you need to in an emergency. Each of the joiners comes with a dust collection port that's built in. Most of them are 4-inch set up there. You can attach dust collection hose. It's just a real nice way to catch all those chips because you're pulling large chips off of here, not really dust. But it's a good way to get that, to suck it right into a dust collector or a system that you've got hooked up in your whole shop. So each one of those has that. That's a pretty standard feature. Another thing to consider is the mobile bases of a tool. If you're going to move this around in your shop, you can take a joiner like this that does not have a mobile base. You can buy, there are a number of aftermarket mobile bases that you can buy and put the machine on it, and then you can roll them around, you can lock them in place. They work real well, but that's an added cost of $50 to $100 sometimes. Another case is some of the machines come with a built-in mobile base. For example, this one has a built-in kickstand caster here that you kick to move it there, where it's got 2 stationary casters on this end, but the kickstand then makes it mobile to swivel like that, and then you can roll it around to wherever you need. And then when you get to your place to work, just release, and it's good and solid. But that's a good way to keep those, to move them around, because a jointer, if you don't want to use it all the time, you can wheel it out of the way and then bring it back out when you're ready to use it.